From the flight deck, we want to turn your attention to the stage for this in-flight edition of the Q&A Cafe as we take your questions about our flight path over the Scriptures. If you have questions, send them to us from our website at BibleFrom30K.org. That's BibleFrom30K.org. All questions will be answered and some will be featured later on our flight. Now, let's join the Q&A Cafe.
Well, what do you got?
Well, we got some questions tonight, some great ones. I'll ask you this first one. This is from Deb online. Do you think we'll meet Solomon in heaven? He started out so well, but finished in a questionable way, having multiplied horses, wives, and gold. The last verses in Ecclesiastes add to the mystery. What do you think?
Well, it's a good question, and I think I'm going to say that there's something underneath the question. I think maybe even a more fitting question in line with that is, how were people saved in the Old Testament? A lot of times people say, well, this person didn't live a good life, this person did. Is that person going to be saved because he lived a good life? By the way, the end part of Ecclesiastes, I think Solomon got it right, because he said, here's the sum of the matter: fear God and keep his commandments. And that's the whole duty of man. So with all of his frustrating journey that he took, I think he had the right answer at the end of the test. You know, he kind of came to the right conclusion in the midst of all of his madness. Now, Solomon didn't live a perfect life, far from it. But how is a person in the Old Testament saved? By faith, the same way a person in the New Testament is saved. So in the Old Testament, people had to place faith that God would atone for their sins through the sacrifices that they were offering on an altar. They were looking forward to Christ. Today we look back to the finished work on the cross. But every single sacrifice that was offered, whether it's a lamb or a ram or a dove, each one of them was a picture of what Jesus Christ would ultimately and totally and finally fulfill. So that had to be done in faith. And the Bible makes it clear that by the deeds of the law shall no flesh be justified, whether it's Solomon or David or anyone else. And so the writer of that passage, Paul the Apostle, looks back to Abraham, the father of faith, and he said that Abraham believed God, and that faith, that belief, was counted to him for righteousness. So all he had to do is believe. Now, what did he believe? Well, not much. He didn't know very much. I mean, he knew that there was a God, that God called him out of idolatry, that God was the only one that could help him, that he was weak and sinful and needed help from God, a Savior. And there were certain prefigurements that he did of Jesus Christ, but he lived by faith and God counted it to him for righteousness. So you look at Solomon. Well, Solomon built a temple, and there was a sacrificial system well established at the time of Solomon. And Solomon, like anybody else, had to place their faith in that atoning work that would be ultimately fulfilled one day.
It's such a great reminder, too, to all of us that Solomon, this man who we look to, he was a great example at times, and then other times made some big mistakes, yet even someone like him can be saved in the end.
Yes, by faith.
Yeah. All right, next question comes to us from a guy named Dave. He says, why was Moses penalized for his actions by not being allowed to go into Israel, where David had great sins and seemed to not be penalized? Being named the guy after God's heart is understandable, given all the repenting he did, but it is weird that there seems to be no penalty for his actions. God seemed really harsh on Moses and not on David. What are we missing? Well, I think this is a great question, because when you first look at it, it does have the appearance as though Moses was punished very harshly and David wasn't. But even in our eyes, it almost seems like Moses should have received more grace than David did. But I think a lot of it has to do with where and when and how the sin took place. For instance, Moses was God's representation to these people. These people looked to Moses as a direct representation of God. David was a little different. Yeah, he was king, he followed the Lord, and he represented God, but not to the exact amount that Moses did. And also, David's sin was done more behind closed doors. It was done more secretly, and because of that, I think it was dealt a little more behind closed doors as well. And Moses' sin was much more public, and it was very, he misrepresented God is basically what he did by by his actions saying that God was angry at his people when he really wasn't. And, now don't go away thinking that David didn't receive any kind of punishment for his sin, because he got a lot of punishment. His son died. He ended up not being able to build the temple. He lost, in fact, Nathan the prophet came to him and said, you've now given these other nations reason to blaspheme the name of God because of what you've done. He lost his moral status, so many things. But I think they were just dealt with in different ways, just like it says in 1 Peter that love covers a multitude of sins. And when it's dealt with in the public, when the sin is public, it needs to be dealt with publicly. When it's a behind closed doors sin, it is often dealt that way as well.
Right. I think that, the last part of his question, what are we missing? And I would just say the rest of the story. And that is, read the next chapter, and you find out you mentioned him, a whole host. I counted 4 consequences. You were telling me, going through that little list. He lost his testimony. You've caused the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. So he lost his testimony. He lost his son, as you mentioned, the son of Bathsheba and David died. He lost his moral high ground to discipline his children. And he lost the ability, the right, the privilege of building the temple. God said, you're a man of blood. You're a murderer, because he murdered Uriah's husband. So he lost an awful lot. And all of those were played out in his lifetime with his family.
All right, next question comes from Candy. It says in 1 Kings 11:13, God tells Solomon, yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. When the kingdom splits, Rehoboam gets one tribe, and Jeroboam gets 10 to rule over. What happens to the other tribe? Later it talks about Judah and Benjamin. I am a little lost on how this all fits together.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because the Lord says, I'm going to rip out all of the tribes and give you one tribe. And then she said, yeah, but I read that there were 2 tribes. There's a couple of ways to look at it. You could look at those 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, all under the tribe of Judah, because the kingdom split and they followed the worship at Jerusalem, because the territory of Jerusalem is actually in Judah or in Benjamin. So Benjamin and Judah were reckoned as one. The other way to look at it is, since Jeroboam was of the tribe of Judah, and God said, I'm only going to give you one tribe, it's already assumed that Judah is who he is, but the other tribe that God gave him was the tribe of Benjamin. So if you look at it technically, there's Judah and Benjamin, but the tribe that God said he would give to him besides his own would be one, and that is Benjamin. Something else to mention. And that is that there was another tribe, the tribe of Simeon, which was down as a part right on the cusp of southern Judah. But later on, they eventually migrated north and settled north, so he really was only over 2 tribes, and one other tribe was given to him.
Great. We have time for one more question, it looks like. This one comes from Nancy. It says, if Jews are the chosen people and they have rejected the Messiah, what happens to the souls of all those who have died and never found Christ? Both Christians and Jews believe in the same God. It's pretty cut and dry, really. If you don't have Christ, you're on your way to hell. That's the message that the Bible gives us very clearly. And something that some people fall into is believing that because the Jews were God's chosen people, that for some reason, all the rules that apply to everybody else don't apply to them. But, they were his chosen people, and they were selected to receive this Messiah that God was sending. But they rejected that Messiah, the very way to get into heaven. And Jesus himself said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And later on in 1 John, it says that if you reject the Son, you've rejected the Father as well. I like how you put it earlier, they're a package deal. If you don't have one, you don't have both. You don't have either. And so it's important for us to understand that although they were known in the Bible as God's chosen people, the same rules go for each one of us. And so that's an important delineation to make. Just because they were the chosen people doesn't make them, have to not abide by those rules.
Right. If it meant that they're sort of exempt from all the other rules, as you put it, then why did Paul labor, suffer, to the point of willing to die to take the gospel to the Jew first and also to the Greek? He belabored 3 chapters saying, I would gladly be accursed from Christ if it meant that my fellow countrymen could be saved. He wanted them saved, implying they're not saved just because they're Jewish. they also need to receive the Jewish Messiah. We're the wild olive branch that's been grafted in. I mean, it's to the Jew first, and then also, so we follow a Jewish Messiah.